Nobody on the wandering Meridian had planned for a dragon. The egg had been sitting in cargo bay 3 for 6 weeks, packed inside a temperature-controlled crate between a crate of geological scanners and a box of replacement filter units. It was about the size of a large watermelon, pale gold, and had been placed there by a loading crew at Station Veldris following a trade arrangement that nobody on the ship had fully read the details of. The manifest said, one Aurelian cultural artifact, handle with care. Roan Delacroix, the ship's chief surveyor, had assumed it was a sculpture. He had been wrong. Petra Halvorsen found out first, because she was the one who went down to cargo bay 3 to look for a replacement wrench set on a Tuesday morning, and she was the one who heard a small cracking sound, and she was the one who turned around to find that the crate had opened itself from the inside. She stared, the thing inside stared back. It was the size of a large house cat. Its scales were the color of amber held up to sunlight, bright and warm and slightly translucent at the edges. Its eyes were enormous and gold, with vertical pupils that caught the cargo bay light and made them glow. It had small, tightly folded wings pressed flat against its back, 4 legs with neat little claws, and a tail that curled and uncurled slowly like it was thinking. Petra made a sound that was not quite a word. She took 1 step back, caught her boot on a supply crate, and sat down very hard on the cargo bay floor. From somewhere in the corridor behind her, Yusuf's voice called out, "Did you find the wrench set?" Petra opened her mouth. No sound came out. 3 seconds later, Roan, Yusuf, Niobe, and Captain Dario were all standing in the doorway of cargo bay 3, looking at the small golden creature that was now sitting very still in the middle of the floor, tilting its head at Petra, who was still sitting on the ground and staring. Yusuf said, "That is not a wrench set." Niobe started laughing first. Then Yusuf made a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. Then Roan, who was generally a very composed person, made the mistake of looking at Petra's expression and lost it completely. Even Captain Dario pressed a fist to his mouth and turned slightly away, shoulders shaking. Petra said from the floor, "I sat down very hard." Which made it worse. The small golden creature froze. Its head stopped mid-tilt. Every muscle in its small body went still in the way that a person goes still when they hear something beautiful and unexpected, and they are terrified that it will stop. Its pupils widened. Its tail flattened against the floor. It sat with the absolute focused attention of something that had just heard the most interesting thing in the universe and was not going to miss a single second of it. Then the laughter faded, and the creature made a sound. Soft, high, uncertain. A chirp that went up at the end like a question. It was clearly trying to repeat what it had just heard, and it was clearly doing it very badly, and somehow that made Niobe laugh again, which made Roan laugh again, and the creature froze again in that same electric stillness, drinking it in. "It's an Aurelian dragon," Niobe said when she could speak. She was already pulling out her recorder. "That egg was an Aurelian dragon egg. Those are Roan. Those are one of the oldest species in them." "I know what they are," Roan said. "It bonded," she said. "When it hatched, it imprinted on whoever was in the room, which was," she looked at Petra. Petra, still on the floor, looked at the small golden dragon, which was now looking back at her with an expression of complete and total devotion. "No," Petra said. The dragon chirped, the same upward sound, a little more confident this time. Captain Dario rubbed his face. "We are 4 months from the nearest station," he said. "We cannot return it. We cannot release it. We cannot." He stopped. The dragon had waddled over to Petra, climbed into her lap, and was pressing its small, warm head against her arm. "Don't," Petra said to the room very firmly. "Don't any of you." Yusuf said, very quietly, "It looks very comfortable." Petra put her face in her free hand. The room lost it again. And the dragon, whose name none of them knew yet, whose species had spent 10,000 years hoarding gold and gems and ancient artifacts of immeasurable power, sat in Petra's lap in a cargo bay full of geological scanners and filter units and a missing wrench set, and listened to 11 humans laugh, and was still. As if it had found exactly what it was looking for. Niobe wrote in her log that night, "Subject appears to treat human laughter as a primary stimulus. He is collecting it. I do not yet know what for, but I have never seen anything listen the way he listens." She did not have a name for him yet. That would come later. For now, he was just the small warm thing that had hatched in Cargo Bay 3 on a Tuesday and had immediately decided that this ship, these people, and this sound they kept making were the most important things he had ever encountered. He was not wrong. They named him Solis because Niobe said it meant sun in an old Earth language, and he was golden and warm and impossible to ignore. Petra said she had not agreed to name him anything. Solis climbed onto her shoulder and went to sleep, and the matter was settled. By his second month aboard the Meridian, Solis was the size of a medium dog. He could not yet speak. He could, however, communicate with great clarity using a system of chirps, tail movements, and what Yusuf described as pointed staring that makes me feel like I owe him money. He followed the crew through the ship's corridors, attended every meal, and had strong opinions about whose bunk was the correct place to sleep. He cycled through all of them. He was not subtle about his preferences. Roan was the one who first noticed the objects going missing. It started small. His favorite coffee mug disappeared 3 days after he spilled it laughing at one of Callister's stories, and the mug had rolled across the table in a slow, wobbling circle that had taken entirely too long to fall off the edge. Then Yusuf's stylus vanished the same afternoon. Yusuf made a dry observation about the gas giant they were mapping, and the entire survey team had taken a moment to appreciate it. Then the old deck of playing cards that lived in the common room disappeared the morning after a long night of bad card games and worse jokes. Roan found them in Solis's sleeping alcove, tucked into the space behind the heat vent where Solis had made his bed. The mug was set upright. The stylus was laid neatly beside it. The playing cards were stacked with a care that the crew had never bothered with themselves. He stood there looking at it for a long moment. Then he went and found Niobe. She crouched in front of the alcove and studied the arrangement without touching it. Solis sat behind her, watching her look at his things, and did not seem alarmed. He seemed, if anything, pleased that someone was paying proper attention. "He's building a hoard," Niobe said. "I know what a hoard is," Roan said, "but those are a broken mug and a deck of cards." "The objects aren't the point," she said slowly. "Look at what links them. The mug was present when you laughed hard enough to spill it. The stylus was in Yusuf's hand when he made that joke. The cards were on the table during that whole night last week." She sat back. "He's not collecting objects. He's collecting the moments. The things are just markers, evidence." Solis chirped, a calm, confirmatory sound. "You understand what I'm saying, don't you?" Niobe said to him. Solis looked at her with his large gold eyes and curled his tail neatly around his feet. Roan contacted the Aurelian cultural liaison 2 days later. Her name was Seren, and she was old in the way that made human age look like a rough draft. She appeared on screen with the particular stillness of someone who had not been surprised by anything in several centuries. She was surprised now. Roan explained what Solis was collecting and how he was storing it. Seren listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "A hoard forms around what the dragon values most. It is not a choice. It is not a habit. It is the deepest instinct of the Aurelian line, and it cannot be redirected or faked." She paused. "What you are describing should not be possible." "And yet," Roan said. Seren ended the call shortly after. She did not explain why. The Meridian docked at a neutral trade post called Hessa Port for resupply at the end of the second month. Solis came along, because Solis came everywhere, and because the one time they had left him on the ship, he had rearranged every item in the engineering bay by size and then gone to sleep on top of the result. And Petra had refused to move him on principle. Hessa Port was small but busy. 3 Varkai diplomats in their pale, formal coverings were negotiating cargo rates near the main dock. 2 Drevathi merchants stood near a supply counter, their stone-gray skin making them look like statues someone had dressed in traveling clothes. Every single one of them stopped when Solis walked in. The Vorkai went very still in the particular way of beings who are trying to decide whether to bow or run. The Drevasi stared with the focused intensity of people who had seen a great deal of history and were watching it happen again. Solis ignored them completely. He walked to where Petra was arguing about the price of coolant fluid, climbed onto the supply counter beside her, and looked at the vendor with an expression that clearly communicated, "She is right and you are wrong." The vendor gave Petra the coolant at the original price. Behind them, one of the Drevasi merchants leaned close to her companion and said something very quietly. Her companion watched Solis for a moment, then replied. Niobe, who had a translation device, caught it. She wrote it in her log that night. The little one watches the humans like they are the rarest things in the universe. And the reply, perhaps to it they are. She sat with that for a while before she turned the recorder off. In his alcove that night, Solis rearranged his collection. He added one new item, a small price tag that had fallen off the coolant unit when Petra won her argument, and that she had laughed at because it had landed on his nose. He set it next to the playing cards. It was the most worthless thing on the ship. He treated it like it was made of gold. The asteroid field came out of nowhere, the way bad things usually do. 6 months into the mission, the Meridian was cutting through a debris corridor in an unmapped system when the nav array gave a reading 3 seconds too late. What followed was 11 minutes of controlled chaos that left 2 hull panels dented, the secondary power coupling cracked, and Yusuf with a bruised shoulder and a look on his face that meant he was not going to discuss what the alternative outcome had been. The ship was fine, the crew was fine, but something in the air was not fine, and it stayed that way. The arguments started small: supply allocation, schedule conflicts. Someone used the last of the good coffee and did not report it. Small things, the kind of small things that are never really about themselves. Meals got quieter. The common room, which had always been loud in the evenings, started emptying earlier. Callister, who normally talked enough for 3 people, stopped in the middle of sentences and did not finish them. Nobody laughed much. Solis noticed immediately. He began following people more closely, not in his usual curious way, trotting behind them with his tail up and his head turning at everything interesting. This was different. He pressed close to people's sides. He put his head on their laps without being invited. He made a low sound, not a chirp, something slower and steadier, almost like a hum that Niobe had never heard from him before. He stopped eating well. His hoard sat untouched. Niobe watched him for 2 days and wrote in her log, Solis is not reacting to the silence. He is reacting to what is underneath the silence. He is looking for something that isn't there, and it is distressing him. She thought about that for a long time. On the 4th night after the asteroid incident, Roan could not sleep. He went to the observation deck because it was the quietest place on the ship, and sat in the dark with the stars outside the viewport and a cup of something that had been labeled tea but tasted like ambition and regret. Solis found him in under 4 minutes. He climbed up beside Roan and sat there, not pressing, not demanding, just present. His scales caught the starlight and held it. Roan looked at him. Then, because it was very late and very quiet and there was nobody else, he started talking. He talked about his wife, who had died 4 years ago and who had laughed at everything, including things that were not funny, which had been one of her best qualities. He talked about the time he had shown up to an important career interview with his shirt on inside out and had not noticed until 3 hours later. He talked about how strange it was, being 43 years old, responsible for an 11-person survey crew and 1 small dragon, floating in the dark between stars that did not have names yet. He laughed once, quietly, at himself mostly, at the sheer absurdity of all of it. Solis pressed against his side and began to hum, the same slow sound, but now that Roan was listening properly, it was not just a sound. It was warm. It moved through his ribs like something physical. Niobe would later identify it as an Aurelian comfort response, a thing dragons did for bonded family members. It was not something Solis had been taught. It was something he simply knew. They sat there for a long time, the man and the dragon, in the dark above the stars. The crew came back slowly, the way crews do, one conversation at a time, one shared meal that went a little longer than the others. Callister started finishing her sentences again. Yusuf made a remark about the asteroid incident so dry and precise that Petra snorted soup, and then looked guilty about it, and then laughed at herself for looking guilty. And suddenly the common room was loud again, and Solis was in the middle of it with his head up and his tail moving in quick, happy sweeps. He ate a full meal that evening for the first time in 5 days. But the moment Niobe thought about most happened 2 days before the crew fully recovered. Yusuf was sitting alone in the navigation bay going through correction logs, doing the quiet, precise work he did when he was processing difficult things. Solis wandered in and sat beside his chair. They stayed like that for a while. Yusuf worked, Solis watched. Then Yusuf said, to no one in particular, without looking up from his screen, "We flew through an asteroid field because the nav array was reading at exactly the delay we had documented 3 months ago in a maintenance report that nobody actioned. We almost died because of a very small administrative failure. That is, in my view, extremely on brand for this mission." He said it completely flat, no expression, eyes still on the screen. Solis stared at him. 4 seconds passed. Then Solis made a sound. It was new, short and bright and a little surprised, like something had caught him off guard from the inside. His scales flashed warm. His tail hit the floor once, hard, like he hadn't meant it to. He had laughed. Yusuf looked at him for a moment, then he turned back to his screen. "Don't read too much into it," he said. Solis chirped, then made the laughing sound again, softer. Niobe, who had been walking past the open doorway, stopped and wrote it down. "Yusuf's humor is the rarest thing on this ship. It requires you to be paying attention. It rewards patience. Solis figured this out before any of us thought to explain it. He is not collecting sounds, he is collecting understanding." Word traveled faster than the meridian. By the time the ship docked at Galactic Union Station Ardennes for resupply, 12 months into the mission, the story had already arrived. A human survey vessel with an Aurelian dragon hatchling aboard, bonded, traveling openly. The dragon accompanied the crew everywhere and had been observed by at least 4 independent sources at Hesse Port, ignoring every other species in the port to sit on a supply counter next to a human who was arguing about coolant prices. The observation deck at Ardennes was, politely speaking, full. Solis was now the size of a large wolf. His scales had deepened from pale amber to a richer gold, and when the docking bay lights caught him at the right angle, he looked like something from a very old story. He walked down the docking ramp between Rhone and Petra with his head up and his tail level, and the crowd of observers on the deck above went very quiet. 3 Vorkai officials in formal white coverings were present. Admiral Siova of the Orvathy Union Fleet was present, which was unusual enough that Niobe noted it twice. And at the far end of the bay, very still, very tall, with the quality of someone who has been patient for a long time and has learned to make patience look like a choice, stood Elder Seren. She had come in person. The Vorkai delegation moved forward first, performing the formal Aurelian greeting, a long lowering of the head, palms open, the words of acknowledgement delivered in old Aurelian script from a prepared card. It was correct in every detail. Solis walked past them. He went directly to where Petra was already in a dispute with a docking official about parking fees. Climbed onto the equipment crate beside her and looked at the official with patient, total certainty. The docking fee was waived. Behind them, Delegate Huron of the Vorkai, who had just completed a ceremonially perfect greeting that had been ignored, made a sound that his translator rendered as, "This is not what the texts describe." Elder Seren watched all of it from across the bay and said nothing. Roan found her an hour later, after the crew had dispersed to resupply errands and Solis had fallen asleep in a patch of warm light near the docking controls. Seren was still in the same place, watching the sleeping dragon. Roan stood beside her and looked too. "You came a long way," he said. "He is the first Aurelian to bond outside the species in 4,000 years," she said. It warranted the trip. He asked her what he had been meaning to ask since her first call 6 months ago, what a hoard actually meant, not the cultural version, the real one. Seren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "A dragon's hoard is the center of everything. It is what they protect. It is what they return to. It is the answer to the question, what in the entire universe matters most to you? The hoard is not chosen. It declares itself. The dragon does not decide what goes in it. The dragon simply cannot help it." Roan thought about the broken mug, and the bent stylus, and the worn playing cards, and the small price tag from a coolant purchase. "He has never put a single valuable thing in it," he said. "No," Seren said, "he has put nothing but valuable things in it." Delegate Huron found them 20 minutes later. He was polite, he was formal. He made a reasonable, well-structured argument that an Aurelian hatchling bonded under uncertain circumstances to a crew of human surveyors represented an unstable situation, that the bond was likely the result of improper exposure conditions rather than genuine affinity, and that transfer to a more suitable environment, either Aurelian or Vorkai custody, would be in the dragon's best developmental interest. He said all of this without raising his voice. Solis, who had been asleep 30 meters away, was no longer asleep. Nobody saw him move. He was simply suddenly between Delegate Huron and the crew. He was not growling. He was not baring teeth. He made no aggressive gesture. He stood very still, wings slightly lifted from his back, eyes fixed on Huron with an attention so complete and focused that the ambient noise of the docking bay seemed to get quieter. Then he made a sound. It was not loud. It was not even particularly dramatic. It was a low, layered tone that came from somewhere deep in his chest and resonated at a frequency that did not match any sound he had made before. It moved through the floor. It moved through the air. Every being in the docking bay turned to look, and then, without quite deciding to, took a step back. Delegate Huron went very still. The sound stopped. Solis folded his wings back. He turned, walked to Petra, and leaned against her leg. Petra put her hand on his back, very casually, as if she had not just watched a wolf-sized dragon produce a sound that made an entire docking bay of alien species flinch. "Good boy," she said quietly. Admiral Siova, from the observation level above, radioed her ship. Her crew heard her say, "The bond assessment is complete. Log it as confirmed and do not pursue the transfer request. No, I am not explaining further. Stand by." Seren walked to Huron and said, calmly, "The bond is complete. There is nothing to transfer, and I would ask that you not threaten his hoard again." Huron looked at her. "Those humans are his hoard." Seren looked back at the crew, Petra with her hand on Solis's back, Roan watching everything with careful eyes, Callister already talking again, Yusuf standing slightly apart with his arms folded, and an expression that said he had opinions about all of this and would share them when asked. "Yes," she said simply, "they are." Solis spoke his first clear sentence 18 months into the mission, and nobody was ready for it. Petra was carrying a tray of food across the common room, talking over her shoulder to Callister, not watching where she was going. The tray hit the edge of the table and went straight up and then straight down and distributed its contents across the floor in a remarkably thorough way. Petra stood in the middle of the result, looked down, and said a word she normally reserved for engineering emergencies. The crew laughed. They always laughed when Petra fell into situations like this, and she always laughed too because she had long ago decided that her relationship with gravity was a comedy and not a tragedy. Solis sat up from his place by the wall, watched the whole thing with enormous focused eyes, and said, slowly and deliberately, in accented but perfectly understandable galactic standard, "Again, do again." Everyone stopped. Petra turned and looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression of complete sincerity. He had clearly meant it as a request. Callister said, "Did he just?" "Yes," Roan said. Solis looked at the empty tray on the floor. then at Petra, then at the room, clearly waiting. Niobe started laughing first, then the rest of them, and Solis sat in the middle of all of it looking deeply satisfied, the way he always did, like someone who had lit a fire and was watching it do exactly what fire is supposed to do. He talked more after that, not constantly, not easily, but with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing every word because they knew how much words cost. He asked questions. He made observations. He did not make jokes exactly, but he had developed a sense of timing that was not entirely unlike Yusuf's, a quality of saying the right true thing at the precise moment it landed hardest. Niobe published her paper 2 months later. It went into the Galactic Union academic record under the title, On the Cognitive Significance of Human Laughter as Observed Through Aurelian Bonding Behavior. She had spent a long time on it. Every word was careful. The argument she made was this: Solis did not value laughter as a sound, or as a social signal, or as a marker of happiness. He valued it as evidence of a specific and extremely rare cognitive capacity. Laughter, she wrote, requires an entity to hold two conflicting ideas at the same time, what is expected and what actually happened. It requires the recognition of incongruity. It requires the ability to experience surprise without being overwhelmed by it. It requires the willingness to share an internal state with others. And it requires, most critically, the capacity to find relief in absurdity, to take a painful or frightening or embarrassing thing and transform it, socially and internally, into something that loses its power to harm. Every one of those things, she noted, is neurologically demanding. Most species managed one or two of them on a good day. Humans did all of them constantly, casually, and without any apparent awareness that they were doing something unusual. The paper caused more debate in more species academic institutions than anything published in the previous decade. The Orvathi Science Council released a statement saying the hypothesis was speculative and anthropocentric. They then quietly ran their own analysis. They did not publish the results, but Admiral Siova began dropping by the Meridian's dock whenever their paths crossed, always with some practical pretense, always finding a reason to observe the crew for a few minutes before leaving. Solis began reading human history. He was systematic about it in the way Aurelians were systematic about everything they cared about. He went through comedy first, then drama, then the places where they mixed. He watched old recordings of people laughing at funerals, at their own failures, at things that had hurt them badly. At the end of terrible experiences, they were calling stories now because surviving something is how it stops being a wound and becomes a thing you can tell. He came to Rhone with a question on a quiet evening in the 18th month, when the survey was nearly done and the stars outside were ones they had mapped themselves and therefore knew by names they had made up, which Rhone thought was one of the better things about the job. Humans laugh at things that hurt them, Solis said. It was not quite a question. Sometimes, Rhone said. Not because the hurt is gone. No. Solis was quiet for a moment. Because they are carrying it, he said slowly, and making it lighter by sharing it as a joke. Rhone thought about that, about his wife, about the asteroid, about Petra on the floor of the cargo bay the first day, sitting in a completely undignified heap with a dragon in her lap looking at her like she was the answer to something. That's about right, he said. Solis said, that is not a small thing. No. That is the largest thing, Solis said. I have been looking at your history for weeks. You have been doing this since the beginning, since before you had words for it. You made terrible things into stories and the stories into things you could hold. He paused. Other species fear what they cannot control. You make it into a joke and then you are not afraid of it anymore. Rhone said, we are still afraid. The joke doesn't fix it. I know, Solis said, but you are afraid and you are still here. You keep choosing to still be here. He looked at Rhone with the enormous gold eyes that had first opened in a cargo bay and found a crew of people laughing. That is what I have been collecting, he said quietly. Not the sound, the proof. He added something new to his hoard that night. A small recording device with 18 months of the crew's voices on it. Meals and arguments and late nights and that long strange session with the playing cards, and the night Roan talked to the stars about his wife and laughed softly at himself. He set it next to the bent stylus. Proof of the largest thing. 3 years end the same way they begin, without asking permission. The survey was complete. The Meridian had mapped 47 systems, named 219 stars, and logged geological data on 63 planets that would take other teams years to fully process. The contracts were done. The crew was going home. And Solis, who had hatched the size of a house cat in a cargo bay on a Tuesday, was now larger than any vehicle aboard the ship he had lived in for 3 years. His wingspan, when he stretched it, filled the main docking corridor. His scales had gone from amber to deep, warm gold, shot through with lines of brighter color that moved when he breathed, like sunlight on shallow water. He was, by any measure, extraordinary. He was also too large to stay. The Aurelian delegation met them at Union Central Station. 3 elders, and Elder Seren among them, standing at the docking bay with the particular stillness of very old beings who have watched a great many things happen and have learned to wait for the end before drawing conclusions. They were respectful, they were clear. Solis had reached the age at which Aurelian adolescence required structured development, other dragons, older knowledge, things that a human survey crew in deep space could not provide. This was not a criticism. It was the nature of growth. He would attend the Aurelian Academy. He would form bonds with his own kind. His attachment to the crew was genuine, the elders said carefully, but it was the attachment of early life. It would, with time, become a fond memory. Solis listened to all of this without moving. Then he said, "No." Not loudly, not with the chest-deep tone that had silenced a docking bay, just a flat word, simple and complete. One of the elders said, gently, that he would build a new hoard. It was the nature of growth. Solis looked at them. "What is in your hoards?" he asked. They answered, because Aurelians were honest about their hoards. Ancient gold, artifacts of historical significance, rare mineral formations, objects that had passed through the hands of great Aurelian figures, irreplaceable things. Solis nodded slowly. Then he said, "I do not think we value the same things. I do not think that is an accident." Elder Seren said, "What do you mean?" "The elder who gave my egg to the humans," Solis said, "he knew what he was doing. Aurelian eggs are not given carelessly. He gave my egg to a human crew specifically. He knew what they were. He knew what I would find." He looked at Seren. "Why?" Seren was quiet for a long time. Her silence was the answer. Roan looked at her. She did not look away. Whatever the old elder had intended, she knew it. Whatever experiment or hope or ancient calculation had placed that egg in a cargo bay between geological scanners and filter units, she had been part of it. "He believed," she said finally, very quietly, "that the next generation of Aurelians needed to understand something that 4,000 years of our own company had caused us to forget. What we value," Solis said. "What is worth valuing," she said. The compromise took 3 hours to negotiate. Solis would attend the academy. The crew of the Meridian would hold permanent liaison status, an arrangement with no precedent in Aurelian history and which required a document 11 pages long to describe properly. He would return to them at regular intervals. His hoard would travel with him, housed in a facility designed specifically for it, which the Aurelian Council agreed to fund without being asked twice. Then there was nothing left but the goodbye. The crew stood on the docking bay in a loose group, the way they always stood, nobody quite in a line, Callister already talking, Yusuf slightly apart, Petra in the front with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the way that meant she was not going to do anything embarrassing, which meant she probably was. Solis stood before them. The size of him still surprised people who hadn't known him since he was a house cat in a cargo bay. He looked at the 11 of them with his enormous gold eyes, and he waited. Niobe went first. She told him about the paper she was working on, a follow-up, and described it with enough dry academic language that it was almost funny, and his scales flashed warm. Callister talked for 4 minutes without pausing, which was actually restrained for her, and ended with something that made him produce the short, bright laugh they had first heard in the navigation Bay 18 months ago. They went one by one. Some told jokes. Some said things that weren't quite jokes, but landed the same way. Each time Solis's scales moved with light, and each time the sound he made was a little different, shaped by who had made it happen, carrying the specific texture of that person the way his hoard carried the specific texture of each moment. Yusuf was second to last. He stood in front of Solis for a moment and said nothing. Then he said, "You are the strangest thing I have ever encountered." Solis looked at him. "I was going to say the same about you." Yusuf said nothing for a moment. Then he made a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. Solis's scales lit up like he had been given something rare. Roan was last. He stood in front of Solis and did not reach for a joke. He just looked at him, at the dragon that had hatched in his cargo bay and learned to laugh in his nav room and pressed against his side on a dark observation deck, and listened to him talk about his wife and the stars and the strange absurdity of being alive. "You picked well," he said. Solis looked at him with the eyes that had first opened 3 years ago looking for something and had found it immediately. "So did you," he said. In the formal Aurelian record, the hoard of Solis the Golden was later catalogued as follows: 1 broken mug, 1 bent stylus, 1 worn deck of cards, 1 small price tag, 1 torn jacket sleeve, 1 audio recording, and 11 humans who had never known they were treasure. The cataloging archivist noted, in a small footnote that was not required but was included anyway, value incalculable.